Welcome to the Inside Elections podcast, where we analyze elections in a nonpartisan, data-driven, and accessible way. In this episode, we'll talk about our latest House battleground poll in a toss-up race, run through our recent House, governor, and presidential ratings changes, and talk about the art of the interview with special guest Chuck Todd of NBC News. Buckle up. I'm Jacob Rubashkin, Deputy Editor of Inside Elections, the go-to place for nonpartisan political analysis for the last 40 years. And I spent Labor Day in West Virginia's 2nd District, which is represented for now by Congressman Alex Mooney on the lovely Shenandoah River.
And I'm Nathan Gonzales, editor and publisher of Inside Elections, and my Labor Day was also water-related as we spent the day at the pool in Cheverly, Maryland, which is just across the border from Northeast D.C., in the 4th District, represented by Democrat Glenn Ivey. Now, a little bit later on, we'll be joined by Chuck Todd of NBC News, but first, we've got a few big items to go over. We are releasing our 3rd House Battleground poll in partnership with Noble Predictive Insights. This time it's in Oregon's 5th District, which is one of the dozen toss-up races in the country. Let's quickly listen to ads from Republican Congresswoman Lori Chavez DeRemer and Democrat Janelle Bynum.
Politics? Well, it's a mess, but that hasn't stopped me from getting things done for Oregon. I fought successfully to eliminate federal funding for tolling our roads. And while Oregon politicians decriminalize drugs, I opposed every effort to defund our police. I helped pass legislation to get fentanyl off our streets, and the criminals who are trafficking those drugs behind bars. I'm proud to be your Congresswoman, and I'll keep fighting to get the job done for you. I'm Lori Chavez DeRemer, and I approve this message.
As a mom of 4 kids, I worry when my family leaves the house. I won't rest until our communities are safe. In Salem, I brought Republicans and Democrats together to recriminalize fentanyl and other hard drugs. In Congress, I'll work with local law enforcement to get the officers and resources Oregon needs. I'm Janelle Bynum, and I approve this message because I will never play politics with protecting your family or mine.
So, Jacob, what are the top lines from our poll?
Well, let's just get right into it. Our poll, which was in the field from August 26 to 28, tested the matchup between Chavez DeRemer, the Republican, and Bynum, the Democrat, as well as the presidential election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. It also asked voters their opinions on some hot-button issues and ballot measures taking place this fall. In the House race, which is rated toss-up by us at Inside Elections, Bynum, the Democrat, led Chavez DeRemer by 2 points, 41% to 39%. An independent candidate that we included on the ballot took another 1%, and a full 19% of voters in the district were undecided. In the presidential race, Kamala Harris led Donald Trump by 8 points, 50% to 42%. In the head-to-head, she led by 5 points in the multi-way ballot, which included some third-party candidates, Jill Stein and Cornel West. Now, how does that compare to previous years? Well, pretty much in line with the results that we've seen over the last couple cycles. A very close House election in 2022, Lori Chavez DeRemer won her seat by 2 points, 51-49%. And in 2020, Biden would have carried this district as it's currently drawn by 9 points, 53-44%.
And if we're comparing these results to our 2 previous surveys, I would say this is overall good news for Democrats, because the first poll that we conducted in Michigan's 7th District was taken before Biden dropped out and was replaced with Harris. And in that survey, it showed that Biden was dramatically underperforming compared to his own 2020 performance. And now we have 2 surveys, Ohio's 9th District and Oregon's 5th District, where Harris is either matching or exceeding where Biden was in 2020. And that is a critical piece if Democrats are going to gain the 4 seats that they need for the House. They need Harris to do well at the top of the ticket because of the general lack of ticket splitting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that overall this is a decent result for Democrats. It's obviously not perhaps as great as the Ohio 9 poll that actually had Harris doing better than Biden in that district, tied in a district that Trump won in 2020, and Marcy Kaptur up 10 points over her Republican opponent. But this is still pretty good news for Democrats that they haven't totally lost ground in these blue states like Republicans had perhaps been hoping. And there's even more kind of good news for Democrats in that the undecideds include a bit more Democratic voters. I mean, Janelle Bynum has not consolidated as much of the Democratic vote as Lori Chavez DeRemer has consolidated the Republican vote. So there is room for her to grow. Obviously, with 19% undecided, there's room for both candidates to grow. And we expect this to be a close race like it was 2 years ago. But certainly we're not seeing the kind of numbers that would suggest a wipeout on the Democratic side like some people were anticipating when Joe Biden was still the nominee at the top of the ticket.
Yeah, I think a wipeout on or I guess Democrats getting wiped out, right? That's what that's what you're saying. And right now the race is one of the biggest pieces of the race is to define Bynum, right? You mentioned her 28 to 20 name ID. So that means a little more than half of voters don't know enough about her in order to have an opinion of her. And so that's why you see in those ads that were played where Republicans are trying to portray her as wanting to decriminalize all drugs and soft on the borders, and Bynum is trying to paint a different picture of herself. So as her name ID increases through television ads, voters are going to be seeing different portraits of her, and that will impact the race. And of course, Democrats are going to try to hold the Congresswoman responsible for various things that they don't like. So this is everyone who listens to this podcast knows my Oregon bias, and I can say that I'm happy that this race is, I think, going to be pretty much at the epicenter of the fight for the House from now until November.
And Nathan, you made a great point about Bynum's image rating, her name ID sitting at under 50% of voters having an opinion of her. Chavez DeRemer, better known, also positively viewed, 39% favorable, 30% unfavorable. So almost 70% of voters able to offer an opinion on her. I think this cuts against perhaps one of Democrats' talking points on this race that we've certainly heard a lot of, and I think a lot of people who have been tracking this contest have heard, which is that Janelle Bynum has beaten Lori Chavez DeRemer twice before in state house races. And her allies, Bynum's allies, point to that as evidence for why she should be the nominee over Jamie McLeod Skinner, and why she is going to beat Lori Chavez DeRemer a third time. Well, as Nathan, you like to say, winning a state house race, very different ballgame than winning a U.S. House race. And simply by virtue of being a freshman member of Congress, Chavez DeRemer's name ID is significantly higher than Janelle Bynum's, even though she's 0-2 against Bynum in previous races. So absolutely something to keep in mind in this race. But like you said, also upside for Bynum there. She can introduce herself to more voters in what is still a Democratic, perhaps tilting district in terms of the partisan makeup over the next 2 months.
And we'll see, this district is almost entirely east of I-5 from the Portland suburbs down into part of the Willamette Valley into Central Oregon. And we're checking to see whether the 6th district west of I-5 this is where Democratic Congresswoman Andrea Salinas is running for re-election. We have it rated as likely Democratic. Republicans are kind of making some noise about it, but yet no one is investing money, whether it's the parties or CLF investing in money in the race, or Mike Erickson, the Republican nominee who ran last time, lost by just a couple of points and has not invested his own money, written a check of his own to write. So we'll see. Maybe there are more. Oregon could be a hotbed, but right now the 5th district is where it's at.
And that's not the only exciting news that Inside Elections has rolled out recently. We also did a handful of ratings changes across the board, House, governor, presidential, Nathan, give us the highlight here of the races that we moved at the end of last week.
Yeah, two of them center around North Carolina. In the presidential race, we moved North Carolina from tilt Republican to toss-up. So this would be good news for Harris because it looked like, and Harris and the Democrats, because it looked like North Carolina was firmly out of reach in Trump's column with Biden when Biden was on the ticket. And now this is an example of how the battleground, the Electoral College battleground, has shifted a little bit, where she's doing better in the toss-up. She's competing and maybe even leading in a couple of the 6 core toss-up states that you can see on our website, but also now North Carolina is that 7th seat. And so that is one rating change that we made. We also changed our rating in the governor's race in North Carolina from toss-up to tilt Democratic. So this is where Democratic State Attorney General Josh Stein is facing Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, the Republican. Robinson has said a bunch of controversial and offensive things over the years. Republicans are highlighting those, and it looks like this race is quickly getting out of control on the Republican side and in favor of Democrats. And so this is an acknowledgement that Stein at least has a small, if not significant, advantage in that race. We also made rating changes in 7 House races. Jacob, do you want to highlight a couple of these?
Yeah, let's do the rundown here. So a mixed bag in terms of partisanship. The 7 changes that we made, I think they split four in Democrats' favor and 3 in Republicans' favor. We moved 2 races into our toss-up category, one from each side of the ledger. So Michigan's 8th district, which is an open seat. Congressman Dan Kildee is not seeking re-election. We moved that from tilt Democratic into toss-up. A couple days later, Congressional Leadership Fund announced a big ad buy there in support of their Republican candidate, Paul Young. Democrats are running a state senator named Kristen McDonald-Rivet. That is going to be a very competitive race. It's a district that centered on Flint, Michigan, but really moving away from Democrats relative to the partisanship of the state. It's going to be a trouble spot for them this election cycle and going to be tough to keep moving forward. On the other side of the ledger, we have Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, a very important seat, not only for the fight for the majority, but also because it casts its own electoral vote. And it is one vote that could be crucial to the path to victory for either Vice President Harris or former President Trump. We had that rated tilt Republican. We moved it into toss-up, a reflection of Don Bacon's more precarious position. He's the Republican incumbent, and at this point, everyone pretty much agrees that he is trailing his Democratic opponent, State Senator Tony Vargas, by a couple points, give or take, and that Harris is well positioned to win this seat at the top of the ticket. So Bacon is no stranger to running from behind. He was also trailing Tony Vargas in 2022 when they faced off against each other. He had tough races in 2018 and 2020. This is familiar territory for him, but it's still a race that Democrats are pretty bullish on. Beyond that, a couple of seats here and there. The other one I'll single out is New York 17. Now, this is a seat that should be one of Democrats' best pickup opportunities. Biden would have carried this district in the lower Hudson Valley by 12 points in 2020. It was a very narrow victory for Republican Mike Lawler in 2022. And Democrats have a former member of Congress who is one of their party's best fundraisers as their standard bearers in this seat, Mondaire Jones. It just isn't clicking right now. Jones is trailing. He is outraising Lawler, but he has not found a way to outperform him with voters. And perhaps crucially, Jones lost out on the Working Families Party line in this district, which means that there will be a candidate running for the traditionally progressive party in New York that could siphon away votes from him in his general election bid. There's some shenanigans that went on here. It's a Republican plant, essentially, who won the Working Families Party line for what I think is fair to say, the sole purpose of messing with Jones's general election campaign. And it's succeeding. I mean, it makes what was already a tough task against Lawler that much more difficult. We moved that race from toss-up to tilt Republican. We'll see what happens over the next 2 months. We're not counting Jones out. He's going up on TV this week, but he's got room to make up. He's got ground to make up. And Lawler, still looks strong in a district that is going to vote Democratic for everything else on the ticket.
And our subscribers got all these changes last week, and now the basics of those are available on our website now. The last one I'll mention is Virginia's 7th district, where we moved that from tilt Democratic to toss-up. This is an open Democratic seat in Central Virginia, represented by Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, who's not running for re-election because she's focusing on her run for governor next year. But that change was basically confirmed by a multi-million-dollar ad buy in the Washington, D.C. media market by a Congressional Leadership Fund, the big Republican super PAC that focuses on House races. Yeah. So, and the Washington, D.C. market goes all the way down into this district. So that was, I think, confirmation that this is going to be a top race. But let's move on.
I'd like to welcome our special guest today, Chuck Todd. He's the former editor-in-chief of National Journal's Hotline, former NBC News chief White House correspondent, and the 12th moderator of NBC's Meet the Press. Chuck, welcome to the show.
Jacob, thank you for leading with the hotline. I appreciate that.
That's the most important pipeline, right?
Well, it's the club, like we're all in the same club, right? There's all these various Washington tribes, right? And this is a strong tribe, I think. The Trade Publication Campaign Professionals Club, right? It's a small tribe, but a powerful one.
Absolutely. And the Hotline has produced any number of really fantastic political journalists over the decades. And we're going to get into all that. But before we dive in, Chuck, you got to answer the question that every guest on our podcast leads off with. And that is, what congressional district did you grow up in?
So I grew up in, it's now Florida 27. But when I was growing up, we didn't have 27. I think it was 16. I don't have my old almanac here. That one's at my home office. Dante Fascell was my congressman literally my entire life, I believe. He was my congressional, my member of Congress. And he mostly, basically, you had three people that split up Dade County back then. A guy named Bill Lehman, who was the car dealership guy, Lehman Buick. Claude Pepper, who is sort of one of the probably the most famous member of Congress of the 20th century from the state of Florida. Arguably sort of, somebody that went from FDR all the way to Bill Clinton. Well, not quite Bill Clinton, the Bushes, excuse me. He died before Bill Clinton. And then Dante Fascell. And Dante Fascell is one of these guys that retired in 92. And 92 was one of the greatest years for retirement. It was my first year at the Hotline. We had over 100 competitive House races, because that year you had a confluence of craziness. And I know I just hijacked this question, but Dante Fascell is a part of this story. So you had a confluence of things. You had the normal retirements. You had member versus member. Florida gained maybe 2 or 3, probably 3 that cycle. So you had all these new districts being drawn, particularly in South Florida. Everything was getting cut up. But more importantly, if you retired in 92, you could take your campaign bank account and turn it into personal money. Essentially, your own 401k,
Wow.
And a whole bunch of, and I forgot the check bouncing scandal. I won't get into that, but basically members of Congress could just write checks that had no standing. And it was some members of Congress bounced 700 checks, 800 checks, things like that. Anyway, he decided he was one of those guys that had the $1 million in cash, and he just walked away and he could take it. And personal. Now you can't make that, you cannot turn that money into personal money. You can, put your kids on a payroll, stuff like that, but you couldn't actually directly just walk away with campaign money. 92 was the last year you could do that. So all these people just hung it up. Now, Fascell was the longtime foreign relations. He was on House Foreign Relations forever. And that was sort of his bailiwick, the labor. I was thinking about this yesterday, Labor Day, because the first political event I ever attended was the Dante Fascell Labor Day picnic. And it was just something that everybody went to. My grandfather was a big Republican, but you went because Dante Fascell was the congressman, and you went to his picnic. That's just what you did in down there in that community. And I thought it's what you did everywhere in the 70s and 80s. Back then it was a little more community build. And if you were a Republican in Miami in the 70s, there were a lot of Democrats you had to end up supporting because there weren't any Republicans running for office in the Deep South back then.
So growing up, you knew who your member of Congress was. I mean, you were already plugged in and interested.
Oh, well, I grew up in I grew up in a pretty, like, my father was a pretty politically engaged person. I think I shared in my last podcast that his early political hero was Nelson Rockefeller. He worked for him. Now, when I say worked for him, he got hired to do audio for like a Rockefeller event in '67 in Miami. Like, my father was a musician and had a band, and when you're a musician, you got to do any gig that you can find, right? And if that meant doing audio for some political event, you did that, right? Whatever you could do, type of things. And but he was a big, that was sort of always his politics, was sort of this Rockefeller republicanism. Was who he was, what sort of drove him. So it was front and center in my household. So yeah, I had to know who our senators were and the member of Congress was. And now it is, I think, one of the Diaz-Balarts has where my house is now. I believe it's the last Diaz-Balart, Mario.
Is
right?
it Mario?
Yeah, Lincoln. I think Mario's the only one still in, right?
Yeah, because Lincoln,
Yeah.
Mario, Lincoln is out, and then Jose never was in Congress. He's your coworker.
Right. Correct. He was never in Congress. Carlos Curbelo had it for a cycle. Deborah Merksall Powell had it for a cycle.
I got to wonder which member of Congress walked away with the biggest.
It's a great question.
Campaign stash. Who
I'm
bought
sure
the nicest house?
If you go into the hotline database, I think you'll find it.
If it wasn't gold bars, does it count? Maybe they could get away with it now, unless it was in gold bars.
I mean, poor Bob Menendez, man. He just came 30 years too late. It is astonishing what was legal. Was it in the 80s? You could pass out checks, on the floor. So people talk about like, oh God, Congress is so corrupt. I'm like, oh no, it's not. Oh no, it's not. It used to be. This is nothing. This is small potatoes these days.
No. So, you've had a long career in politics. You've done all sorts of things in print, on TV. You've interviewed a lot of politicians over the course of your time here. I'm curious how politicians are kind of famously known for giving non-answers to questions, especially the ones that they don't want to really discuss. How have you found is the best way to ask people questions that actually get a useful answer when you're interviewing them?
So it is always on the follow-up, right? Any half decent politician is never going to answer the question the way you want them to answer it the first time. And most of them won't do it a second time. It usually takes badgering of some sort to do it. But I also believe in doing it I also think sometimes the biggest mistake that interviewers make is their questions are too long and you fill in the open space. I'm not going to pick on individuals, but you can just look at recent interviews with one of the presidential candidates where the question was longer than the answer. And when the question's longer than the answer, you've asked a bad question. I don't care how short the answer is. You've asked a bad question. And so a lot of times, the best way to truly get an honest answer is to let there be a little bit of silence and don't be the first one to fill the silence, to fill that vacuum. I think and part of it is our culture of immediacy now, which is, my God, everything's on the clock, right? You got 5 minutes on this is why I love podcasts, right? We're less on the clock. I'm not saying we're going to have a 7-hour podcast today, but we might.
Three and a half, hopefully.
We might, between Oregon State football and Miami football, I'm sure we have a lot to discuss because the best player in Oregon State is now our running back. But I digress. So I do think I've had as much success. The badgering has worked, but so has simple questions. Sometimes the simplest question tells you a lot more how it can. I guess I view it this way. I want to know how a politician thinks. by the time I got them on Meet the Press, you're less interested in their specific positions and more on how they get to their positions. Like, why are they supporting what they're supporting, right? You're trying to understand a sense of who they are because you're trying to get an idea, not necessarily of what they're going to, how they're going to deal with the specific issue you're interviewing with, but you're trying to understand how they deal with specific issues, period, particularly when you're interviewing people that want to be president. And I think sometimes that there's too many people that ask questions are worried about how their question is going to be judged rather than focusing on what's the best way to get a more complete answer.
Well, taking that advice and following up, trying to pin you down. Now, what was your favorite interview or most memorable? Those might not be the same thing, or they might be for different reasons.
No, you're absolutely right. They're not the same thing. I would say, my favorite interview was one I did with Dick Cheney after the so-called torture report. If you recall, the Senate Democrats Intelligence Committee led by Dianne Feinstein did a whole thing on essentially what was the, were we torturing in order to get information post 9/11, all that stuff. And it was dubbed the so-called torture report. And we invited Dick Cheney to come on and essentially respond. This was very tough on him. And he said yes. And he was always sort of partial, he never liked to be on a 5-minute interview. He was like, as long as we were going to give him 20 to 30 minutes, which we did. I was both nervous about the interview. This was pretty early in my tenure because I just found him a very formidable figure, right? I knew him some. I had some relationship with him personally just from covering politics in the first part. And I certainly had decent relationships with, and, he always had a fondness for NBC. Pete Williams, who was our longtime justice correspondent, was his spokesperson back in the Wyoming days and went with him to the Pentagon. And so he always trusted NBC. So there was a little bit of, we had a little home field advantage there. But I asked him some brutal questions and, but never personal. And it was just it was what I always said was the model interview. It was an accountability interview, but it was respectful. You understood where he was. You may not like his answers, but it was thorough. And it was what I always wanted to, I wanted every interview to feel that way. And all the work that went into it and all that stuff. But that was, for me, my favorite and one I always hang up there. And it's not one that gets talked about, right? My most talked about one is going to be Kellyanne Conway. I mean, that's going to be in my obituary and hers, which was alternative, where the phrase alternative facts debuted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Obviously, it just turned out to be and look, going into that interview, I hate the interview. I hate seeing clips of it. So it's memorable, but I hate it. I hate that I laughed at one point. I was laughing at the absurdity of the discussion. But I wish I hadn't let the veneer go. A moderator, right? You want to keep it flat. I want to be more umpire than practitioner. So it was. But I'll admit I was just furious at what Spicer did. As a former White House correspondent, that room is sacred. When you stand behind that podium, you tell the truth, period. And if you can't tell the truth, you don't answer. And you say you can't answer.
Yeah.
Whatever anybody thinks of Robert Gibbs, he would evade like shit. The guy never lied to me. He just ghosted me when he knew he'd have to lie to me. He wouldn't do it. So he ghosted me. And then I'd call him on it. And then like after the fact, he'd be like, yeah, look, I had no good answer. And I wasn't going to, because I don't know how you guys are. Whenever I've caught a strategist lying, they're out. I stop dealing with them. And, and there are people to this day that think they deal with me and they have no idea that I just know you have no credibility with me. So it doesn't matter. Whatever you tell me, I'm going to have to go get confirmed somewhere else because you were a bald-faced liar. So I really, and I was like, I can't believe. So I was, I can't believe they're going to lie over a small thing like this. And that was my whole point. If your first day in office, you're lying about something stupid like crowd sizes, how are you going to have any credibility from that podium when we're dealing with war or peace or some sort of national crisis? So I certainly was on my hobby horse about it. I was raring to go about this. I do wish it were in person. I think that that interview was a remote interview. She was on the White House North Lawn. And any of my most acrimonious moments on Meet the Press always took place remote.
Hmm.
And I believe it's because you're sitting by yourself. You're the interviewee. I'm sure some of you have done this. Nathan, I know you have, where you're sitting in a studio by yourself, like a little cubbyhole, and you're staring at a camera. Well, imagine being grilled about your career or about your work, where nobody's in the room but a remote camera. It's a strange feeling. And then there's a slight delay, even in the perfect, and so you can start talking over each other. I'll never forget one back and forth with Ted Cruz where I asked him 9 times whether he was going to support the Republican nominee for president, no matter who it was, back in 2016. And he wouldn't answer the question. And I just said, I think you've answered the question by not answering it, and let the record show 9 times. And he was like, and let the record show I gave you an answer 9 times. It's actually, I will say this, there's nobody I enjoy interviewing more than Ted Cruz. Because he engages. There's this back and forth. He wants to have it. Ted Cruz is the girlfriend or boyfriend is bad for you, but you can't quit. You can't.
That's going to be the blurb of his next book.
I love debating. I love having debates with the guy. I love off the record conversation. He's whip smart. He's a whip smart guy. I think the stuff he does, for his, for the acting, for the base, it's sort of like there's a version of Ted Cruz that's George Will, but we'll never know it, right? Because he chose to go into the field of elective politics, which you have to become a caricature. I think unfortunately these days, and look, but Ted Cruz there are aides of his would tell him, don't go on there. He always gets the best of you type of mindset. But he had the same feeling. Like he just enjoyed the back and forth. And he was, there's something, and I think I'm not alone in this about Cruz, because Cruz is a guy that when you go off the record with him, you get a lot. He's no dummy.
I remember when he came in for a candidate interview, and Stu Rothenberg, I guess the godfather of what is now Inside Elections. What
Your
was
godfather,
the
the Grand Poobah? I used to call it Grand Poobah, right? I had Charlie, Tom Brokaw. Like, what do you call some of these guys? They're just sort of, back in my day, I grew up with the Flintstones, and he belonged to some version of the Elks Club, and the leader of it was called the Grand Poobah. I always thought that was a great title. I want a title like that one day. I just want to be Grand Poobah.
Well, we can try to arrange that. We'll work something out.
I appreciate
it. When Stu talks about our meeting with Ted Cruz, normally we talk about biography and start from the very beginning and kind of ease into the tougher questions. But Cruz came in as a lawyer ready to prosecute a case. He had no interest in talking about anything that happened before that election, that Senate election. But it was one of many interesting candidate interviews.
Mm-hmm.
So on that topic, I am curious. You anchored Meet the Press in a very kind of tumultuous, both in terms of the news scene, but also in terms of kind of the news industry, about a decade from 2013, 14 to 2023. In that time, I feel like the social media era really kind of came on Twitter, and then maybe has started to move from Twitter to TikTok, and the bites that people are willing to digest of these kinds of interviews have just gotten smaller and smaller.
No.
How has doing interviews changed over that time? And you can take this frame longer if you'd like. Did you find yourself conducting interviews differently at the beginning of your time in the hot seat than the end, because you knew in the back of your mind that this was going to get chopped up into 30-second, 60-second clips that were going to go viral on Twitter or TikTok or what have you?
So not the interviews, but the segments. Okay. So take data download, right? Like one of the first things that I brought onto the scene, and, I'm not going to sit here and say I invented data, but I'd like to think that I have mainstream data for sort of generic consumption, for sort of the broader political universe. I mean, I'm not going to, we all worked in this world of data, but it was like, how do you bring some of the stuff that people in our tribe of the sort of the trade publication world, how can you make it digestible And so I viewed our different segments as standalones. So data download, I was something that I would hope would almost be a standalone segment on its own that also made sense on social media. Certainly. So one of the things I would argue for, and I would get into back and forth with my own producers about this, but if we pre-taped an interview, I'm like, oh, great, let's do 25 minutes. We'll do the best 7 or 8 for the Sunday morning crowd, and we'll put everything else online. So that was my mindset about it. This has been I guess, an ongoing debate. I think there's nothing to be gained from an interview that's on Sunday morning that's less than 10 minutes. And yet the attention span, this is where you'd go back and forth. The producer might look at the minute by minute ratings and say, hey, look, people sort of lose steam. And it's true. It doesn't matter, other than like Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, most interviews peak at about minute 8, minute 9, and then you start seeing people fade, right? And everybody's worried about sort of losing that, and all of a sudden you're fading. And so the answer has been, and this is something like, I would say a competitor did it more, right? They just did a lot more 5-minute interviews. One of the Sunday shows, we would sit there and go, where are they putting this? Like you'd have this like, wow, what a guest list. And then literally they were 3-question interviews. And I just thought that was a waste of time. You can get that's what cable news is for, is your 3-question interview. Or that's what Manu, on the Hill is great at, getting that when you get only like 2 shots at somebody walking the hall. That's a walking the halls of Congress interview. That's not a Sunday morning public affairs, tell me what you really think interview. And this is the big sort of debate, which is sort of why I was, and the other problem is, is the operatives. The operatives no longer, they want shorter interviews, because the shorter the interview, the more the interviewee can control the interview. The longer the interview, right, the more the interviewer can control the interview. So what do you think I fell on that debate, right? I wanted longer interviews. Essentially, we used to argue, I hated 3 guest shows. I always said a 3 guest show is like having 2 quarterbacks. It means you have none, right? If you have a 3 guest show, it means you have no lead guest, right? If you have a 2 guest show, that's a different story. And then suddenly, and I was a believer in the 2 guest show with good panel and good data download, and maybe another good feature, meet the press moment, a little history. Because I did believe in the complete meal mindset. I understood it was going to get chopped up, right? But I still wanted to deliver a meal if you wanted to eat your entire meal that morning, right? Yep. So I wanted to give you, and by the way, one of the things I always tried to do is I tried to end even the most contentious interviews with something light, if it had to do with a sports team, something in the state that's the state is proud of, that hey, are you rooting for LSU in the College World Series today? Whatever it was, because I actually used to think the reason I like to end on a light note on those Sunday morning interviews, particularly tougher ones, is I wanted to leave the interviewee with a better feeling about the interview so that they were more likely to come back.
Do you see a long-term role for the flagship Sunday morning shows kind of persisting, even as, like you said, the trend has been toward those smaller and smaller, 3 guest shows, 5-minute interviews? Do you think that this is a format that can last, that can go the distance in this new kind of way of digesting information? And if so, how does it need to adapt without losing the depth and intensity that separates it from a hallway interview in Congress?
Well, I mean, look, what I pioneered, and I think what NBC still embraces over here, is you can't think of it as just a Sunday morning show anymore, right? I think Meet the Press is a strong brand, and I think there should be an embracing of that brand. I wanted to get it out of Sunday morning, right? I thought if it was just a Sunday morning brand, it would be like, let me ask you this. When was the last time you read Time magazine? Right. And it at least still exists. Have you seen Newsweek on the shelves? When was the last time you saw an issue of Newsweek? I don't think they even print a magazine edition anymore. And I know U.S. News, these were staples of my era. And I didn't want the Sunday morning, I took over at a time when people said the same thing. It's over for Sunday morning television. I think I just sort of rejected the idea. Is Sunday morning, can you make an appointment on Sunday morning? No, that's tough. Nobody can, right? Unless you're the NFL. So I'm not going to sit here, right? But I think the larger idea behind Meet the Press survives. I think the Meet the Press brand is stronger than the Sunday morning brand with what you're asking. And I think that, Meet the Press, Face the Nation, those two brands in particular, because they've been around so long, right? Both of them are over 60 years old. I think they exist and are important places going forward. But if you told me always on Sunday morning, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, it's only going to be Sunday morning, right? I think that is still in that sense, that's the mistake. I think people that are in charge of TV networks are still making, that the programming hour matters, right? I think you have to, if you're in the information business and you're looking, and yet your survival is based on the number of people who engage with your information, then you better be not just platform neutral, but you ought to be agnostic about when they decide to get the information. You shouldn't be agnostic on when you get it out, but you're going to have to be comfortable with the fact that, hey, and I got this. I had a lot of, it turned out, and we learned this on, I got great numbers on YouTube for Meet the Press on Monday mornings. And it turned out a lot of people would engage with it Monday. We didn't even post it until midnight on Sunday. And a lot of people just engaged with it first thing Monday morning. And we had, nearly, we started getting upwards of 1 million or more viewers just on YouTube alone, which never counts in the official rating. But it's sort of, we sort of saw this coming. So I think you have to be, I think when we sit there and say Sunday morning, don't get trapped by the idea of a TV guide, right? Of what time things are on, right? Look at the medium we're participating in right now, right? If you were judged by how many people downloaded this right at 3 p.m. when you posted it, or right at 6 p.m. when you posted it, that's not a business model, right? You've got to, most podcasts have, especially in the news and information space, it's about a 72 to 96 hour window. And I think most political engagement is that way.
And I promise everyone, we are going to talk about the 2024 elections. But as we transition, Chuck, you came from the hotline, which is very Senate and House heavy. Why is there so little focus proportionally from the networks and the cable channels on House and Senate elections when it's an entire branch of government?
Buddy, I used to say the same thing before I got to NBC, right? And then you get here,
then
right?
you went to the
and
dark
then you're
side?
like, right. Then I moved over to the dark side, and I was, it's an old fashioned bandwidth issue, right? I would say this, I think the networks cover Senate races better today than they did 20 years ago. Does that mean they cover Senate races well? No, but there is more importance given to, but I think the problem is, and we found this out, I'll give you a good example. I wanted to continue the Senate debate series that Betsy Fisher and Tim Russert started on Meet the Press.
Yeah.
Well, it turned out they were the lowest rated Meet the Presses of Tim's era. And guess why? Because who's interested in Jim Webb and George Allen outside the state of Virginia? Political junkies. Who's interested in Claire McCaskill and
Jim Talent?
Jim Talent, thank you. It was Talent, and that's right. It was Talent and McCaskill. That was one of the Senate debates. Thune and Daschle was one that was certainly had extra interest because Daschle was a Senate leader. But my point is that when you're in the national broadcast business, right, you've got to, you've got, if you're going to go local, it's got to tell a national story. So I think that's, yes, you can do that in a lot of ways, but it just sort of limits how often you're going to, and, it ends up being very character driven. I'm not saying it's the right way to do it. This is why I miss, an Inside Politics, and I don't count what CNN's doing a panel show now. It's not the Inside Politics of my era of the 80s and 90s. That sort of saw it that way. And certainly that's how I treated Meet the Press Now and Meet the Press Daily before that is, is I would like, oh, let's at least do one segment that focuses on, X. But I think it's, if you're going to get judged by who's watching your segments and all that stuff, that's the problem with trying to, it's just limited interest. And you're always going to have a producer in charge of a show that says, well, just use the presidential campaign to cover that issue. Don't use the Senate race to cover that issue. It's almost like the Senate candidates have to be such compelling characters before it gets covered, which then, of course, only, I think, paints a more warped picture of how politics is conducted. But that just, I'm just trying to explain why, Nathan.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean I agree with it. But that's what you learn when you're here.
And then the elections are over and everyone complains about, well, the Senate, nothing can get passed through the Senate because control. It's like, yeah, we've been talking about control of the Senate for the last 2 years and no one's paying attention. Well, if people listen to this podcast, they're paying attention. So we are grateful.
Well, I think the people that self-select to your podcast or my podcast, they do want to watch Claire McCaskill debate Jim Talon, and none of them probably lived in the state of Missouri. So,
And Ken Buck, Michael Bennett, we interviewed Ken Buck the morning after that interview, where that was probably made the difference in the race, and he looked like the soul had been just like he knew the soul had been taken from his body when we interviewed him.
Anyway, the point was I wanted to bring those Senate debates back, and it was a much more ratings-driven mindset. They were like, "Well, they're not. You're giving away viewers, and it is what it is."
Yeah,
and I wonder if it's so for those of us who are truly kind of hooked up to this stuff, that the availability of other kind of avenue. I mean, if I want to watch the Montana Senate debate between John Tester and Tim Sheehy, I remember watching the Monica Tranel versus Ryan Zinke debate last cycle on C-SPAN. I just have to go to cspan.org and I have access to that.
So starting on October 1st, I go to bed every night watching some debates on C-SPAN. I love it. Because I want to. I've done this. I really love that service C-SPAN does, and they just run them on a loop. It's sort of the way the NFL Network runs, starting in August. That just every time you turn it on, there's a tape of some preseason game. In October, there's some debate that they're airing that night, and they'll be like 4 debates in a row. You'll be like, ooh, what do we have on tap? Now, of course, less and less candidates want to do debates, so that's another problem. And the other problem with the Meet the Press debates is suddenly you didn't want to be caught in Washington. Oh, we don't want to have national debate. Like I've had debates that were all set to go, and then suddenly one of the candidates backed out because Chuck Todd's going to nationalize the race. Just my simple presence there gets it more coverage, and that's what they didn't want. But this idea that I was going to ask different questions than the local anchor would, it's just BS. But it was more of what level of attention that they wanted. So
I just had an idea, and Jacob, after this, veer us up to 2024. But I'm wondering if we suggest to Sam Feist, who just took the reins at C-SPAN, for like a red zone. We'll take that NFL metaphor where like here's an abortion question. Let's go to Montana.
Howard Mortman. I'm gonna name check Howard Mortman right now. I hope you're listening, Howard. This is genius right here, what Nathan just came up with. The red zone for Senate and House debates in October. Okay, we're going to take you now live to Billings, Montana. We've got John Tester. Okay. Whoa, we just had a heated exchange in Aurora, Colorado. Let's go live there now.
He got the immigration question. Let's see if he can mess it up. See if we get
okay, it's the witching hour. We're getting to closing statements here.
That's right. All right, Jacob, 2024.
So, Chuck, we saw you at we ran into you in the hallway at Pfizer at the RNC. What number convention was this set of I assume you were in Chicago as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I was.
What number was this for you, and what stood out both in Milwaukee and Chicago in such a crazy presidential year? A bit happened in between RNC and DNC. What stood out for you between those two events this summer?
So it's number 14.
Wow.
I believe for me, conventions wise. So, and it's my second one at United Center. Like that's when you're just like, okay,
You've been around
I've
a
had
while.
2 at Madison Square Garden, 2 at United Center. Um, Look, it's, every year they're more of a TV show, right? And every year you're reminded how much of a propaganda TV show they are, right? I still think, it is still an important trade convention for reporters and strategists and up and coming politicos, people that may want to run for office or want to work in politics. So that part hasn't changed, and I'm sure you guys were able to make contact with people that you've never been able to make contact with, or you're glad you finally did. So it's still fish in a barrel for the professional side of things in the political universe, whether you're on the media side, the strategist side, or the vendor side. But the conventions themselves produce less and less news. The speeches themselves are less and less memorable because they're so controlled. Like I would say that, the biggest change from my first convention in 92 at Madison Square Garden to the most recent convention in Chicago is just the control over the speeches at any time that the speeches are given, right? It used to be first they worried just about the main speakers. Then they worried about, well, we better make sure, and you could just feel the scripting, and it really made it easy to ignore the speeches. Like I'm sitting here, I cannot think of a memorable speech at all. If you wanted to bring your own personality, I think you weren't allowed. Like I remember a couple of conventions ago, Jennifer Granholm just went bonkers. And I say this in a nice way. She just decided to be union leader Jennifer Granholm, where she just sort of just went up there and decided to yell and all this stuff. And I say this again, it grabbed the attention of the convention. It was sort of like she grabbed the audience by the lapels. I still can't remember any remarks from her, but it was memorable in her attempt to try to, and I think in her own way, she was trying to like get back into the fray, and she thought, I'm going to use this moment here a little bit, right? It's harder and harder to get those. You got to really, it's so controlled by the major parties now. And that part of it is where the event itself is a letdown, but it's still an incredible place to go network and source build.
So I'll ask you this, and Nathan, I'll open this up to you as well. I was not at the 2004 convention. I don't want to say what grade I was in, but the red states and blue states speech that Obama gave that is now heralded as his breakout moment on the political scene. Was that at the time seen as something special? I mean, did people leave that convention saying that Obama guy? And if so, have we had a speech like that since? Because it seems like what you're saying is, I don't even think that they're, aside from Angela Alsobrooks, who they specifically labeled as the keynote speaker at the DNC, there didn't seem to be that kind of spotlight moment for any kind of up and coming talent that we'll look back in 20 years and say that was the moment that this person became a national figure.
Right. We haven't had it. And, I was certainly looking for it. I was looking for it potentially on the Republican side. I think the problem, maybe that, one of the things I had a caveat here with the Republican side is that Donald Trump both controls the party now, and then there's all these people that don't want to be a part. So, you're not getting, there's a whole group of potential rising star type of figures that are just not going to speak at his conventions. Either he doesn't want them to speak or they don't want him to speak there. Right. So I think there's just that missed crowd, but I was particularly attuned to Donald Trump Jr. in trying to hear if I was going to, is this a speech we're going to go back to, right? When he decides to run for president in 4 or 8 years, however that works out. But you're right. Like that Obama speech, and it broke through. Everybody knew that night. Nobody remembers Kerry's speech. I remember the awful beginning. I'm John Kerry. I'm reporting for duty. I mean, it was this entire sort of creation of John Kerry war hero, which is why the Swift boat thing that started about a week after that convention was so effective, because here was John Kerry presenting himself, but in a way that he never politically had presented himself. No, but I'm not taking away his biography, but he was leaning on a brand new biography. You're like, huh, okay. And they really sort of poured it on. But when you look back at that convention, it's Obama's speech that sort of that definitely broke through. And look, a lot of people were curious. Obama was a curiosity. I remember doing my candidate we did our candidate interview. Me and the late Von Ververs. He had a better memory of our candidate interview with Obama than I did. But he came in December of 2002 for a candidate interview for the 2004 cycle. He came right after the 2002 elections, and he was all ready. And we were like, boy, who is this guy? And I remember going, like, his middle name's Hussein? Forget it. It was just sort of like, this is 2002, man.
Yeah.
We hadn't decided to even go to war with Saddam Hussein yet,
Yeah,
Nathan talks a lot about taking that interview.
We had you by a couple months. We met with him before the 2002 elections at the urging of his fundraiser at the time, and certainly glad we did. One of the speeches that stuck out to me this time, and it was not hidden because it was Governor Tim Walz's speech, but one of the reasons why it stood out, his delivery, the message, it was also short, right? It was 15 minutes, Jacob, I think, and there was this. Almost all the speeches were just so long. And by the time you got to Tim Walz on Wednesday night, it's like, wow, okay. Everyone was excited, did what he needed to do and got off the stage. Other people probably could have helped themselves by following that example.
Right. But the Republican speeches were certainly much longer than the Democratic speeches. Yeah. In general, it felt like.
And Bill Clinton went too long. Barack Obama.
By the way, this gets into the issue we just talked about with interviews on a Sunday morning show, right? Like, what does the audience want, right? And look what we just said. Oh, look, that shorter speech was more effective.
I'm acting young, even though I'm not young anymore.
In keeping in that vein of interviews running long, I do want to be respectful of everyone's time here, so I'm gonna keep us moving along to our final segment. We've had a great time talking with you, Chuck. We could talk for hours longer, but there is an election season to get to. So let's wrap it up with this, our Look What I Found segment of the show. This is when we talk about anything we've stumbled across over the past week that's interesting. It doesn't have to be political. It can be a TV show, an album, a book, or something else entirely. You never know what you're going to get.
This segment, Chuck, has actually always reminded me of old Daily Rundown with you and Savannah hosting at the end when you could shout out, do whatever you wanted. Maybe we're bringing it back.
Do whatever I want. Well, I'm not going to lie. I have a virus so most people you have to get a flu shot, right, every year to prevent, the worst outcomes of the flu. I probably should get a University of Miami hype shot every year because, every year since, I had the good fortune of growing up in Miami in the 70s and 80s. Part of that good fortune was college football didn't exist until 1983. I don't know if people on this podcast may think they've seen college football before the 80s. And it was this weird triple option crap. Nobody threw the forward pass. Then along came a team, the University of Miami, that started actually throwing the forward pass, and it changed college football forever. I will go to my grave believing today's college football, basically modern college football, started with Miami because it actually brought diversified offense. It diversified it also diversified recruiting, and I can get into that. So I'm a little bit of pounding my chest, a little bit of total fandom here. But ever since, when you grow up, basically, as I had to tell my son, who's 17 and never seen a successful University of Miami season, when I try to inform him, it's like, no, we were Alabama. I swear to God, we were Alabama, and we were, but it was sort of like, yes. He goes, well, it's all in black and white. No, it was color TV. I swear, it just wasn't HD. This isn't like watching Johnny Unitas on Louisville. But I have to say, man, I've been waiting to say Miami is back. I know that every year we think we're back and something, nips us in the bud. But thanks to your Oregon State running back, Damian Martinez there, Mr. Gonzales, and the other remnants of the Pac-12, former Washington State quarterback Cam Ward, I think the Oregon State and Washington State might get their revenge in the form of the University of Miami taking the two best players from those teams and turning it into a potential national title contender. So I'm pretty excited about this college football season. Now, my poor wife, who's a Florida State alum, somehow we're in week one, and it's week one, and they're 0-2. Like, that sucks, right? Like, I've been there. Like, over the last 20 years, right? There's always been some game. Oh, Miami gets to play Alabama first game. We're going to show the nation. And then we'd lose by 30 and my season's over. And then I'm immediately gambling on college football because I have to find something to make me watch football on Saturday. So I'm just ecstatic that I think possibly, sort of, kind of, that University of Miami football games, because there's nothing like University of Miami football playing at night in prime time. And when that, Miami you can say we have fair weather fans. I always say it's because there's a lot to do in Miami. And if you ain't winning, then we're not coming. So, I have a feeling that this bandwagon's going to get crowded in a hurry. And I'm just in a better mood. I can read the sports page on Sunday mornings. It's just like, and we got to humiliate the University of Florida, who, by the way, is having a time. That Ben Sass story, I don't know how much you guys have dug into that, but, Ben Sass, it really is a series of sort of disappointing, it's sort of like DJ Ungalale, the quarterback. All this hype. Like, Sass was like this 5-star guy. Oh, he's going to be a great U.S. senator. Oh, he could be a great university president. And he just doesn't. He's like a 5-star guy who doesn't deliver. He's got all the attributes to be an all-timer, and he face-planted. I'm not going to get into any more of the specifics in that, but it is, you watch it and it's, I used to joke, I can't wait till he's a U.S. senator. He's going to be a great one. I used to say that while he was a U.S. senator, because he was a lot of talk and you'd never sort of see anything. And then University of Florida was a lot of that too. He starts out with a lot of this, and then it just sort of, I guess it's the phrase "emperor has no clothes" was invented for something like this. I hope I'm wrong. Like, every interaction I've ever had with Ben Sass, you're just like, wow, this guy, I think he gets it, but maybe it's just been a show. But whatever it is, he's the 5-star guy that has not produced 5-star results.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to have you back in December or January to recap the college football season and see what
and
kind of
season. And then you're going to ask me why the 8-4 Miami, what happened? And I'm like, well,
it is painful to see Martinez in a Miami uniform, and then in Oregon State trying to ignite a rivalry with Idaho State. Like, oh, we've always hated these guys. It's just like, what are we doing?
Well, doesn't Idaho trying to claim half of Oregon? So come on, right? Or half of Oregon is trying to escape Oregon. I don't know. Which is it, Nathan? Is it Oregonians wanting to leave or Idahoans wanting to conquer?
I think it's Oregonians, a very small portion of Oregonians wanting to leave. Eastern Oregon, but there's probably a 3-podcast series on that.
I'd look forward to your 30 for 30 on that.
That's right. Jacob, what did you find? Anything about Oregon State or Miami?
Nothing about Oregon State or Miami, though. If you haven't read that University of Florida, I think the paper is called The Alligator, the student paper. Yeah. Their reporting on Ben Sass is just incredible. And
but it's done it the old-fashioned way. Sunshine laws. It's all sunshine laws. None of this is, a source, a whisper. Nope. It's just the sunshine laws of the state of Florida. They can't, obfuscate this stuff. It takes a while for them to produce it. And once they produce it, you now realize, I don't think Ben Sass is the reason he left. It's looking more and more likely the reason he claimed he left is not the reason why he left.
Yeah. All right. What did I find? I found a book that I've been waiting to get my hands on for a little while that I finally got out of the library. It's called Help Wanted. It's by a woman named Adele Waldman, who I've mentioned on this podcast before. It's a novel, a story about a team of low-wage workers at a big box store, kind of like a Walmart or something like that in the Hudson Valley, a fictional store in the Hudson Valley. And kind of their striving and stifled dreams of upward mobility within the bureaucracy of this store called Town Square. It's funny, it's sad, it's a quick read, and it is a pretty biting satire. So I've mentioned her other book on the show before, which I also enjoyed, but if you're looking for not exactly a pick-me-up, but a fun way to start the fall, I'd recommend Help Wanted.
Yeah, I'm going to bring this all the way back to National Journal's Hotline because Kirk Beto, the current editor-in-chief, who's a friend of the podcast and friend of Inside Elections, asked for summer book recommendations. And instead of a novel, which I have not read a full novel in quite some time, I gave him a kid's book because we still have a second grader in our house. He's our caboose. And it's actually called The Book with No Pictures. And it's written by B.J. Novak of The Office, and it is very clever. It is delightful. If you have any kids from the ages of 4 to 7 or 8, I can almost guarantee it will be a hit. He's not BJ Novak doesn't sponsor this podcast, but I will plug
Yet.
Yet, exactly. We're open. I will plug The Book with No Pictures, so you should check it out.
By the way, Nathan, have you ever done Grace for President with your kids?
I have not. We have Duck for President.
Duck for President. We had them both, of course. I mean, you name it. I'm sure you get the same thing. I'd get a lot of these gifts when my kids were little. One's in college, one's about to go. But Grace for President teaches the Electoral College.
Wow.
It's actually what it does is it introduces the idea that certain states are worth certain points. Okay. Is how they do it. And it's the most effective kids' version of teaching the Electoral College. Now, some might say, why are we going to teach the Electoral College? Ban the Electoral College. But, people need to learn how our election system works. So Grace for President is a good one. And it also happens to be about electing a girl class president versus a boy class president. So there's a little bit of that going on there, too.
One of my favorite things I've written for Roll Call was dissecting the Amelia Bedelia for mayor book. The books are already absurd.
Yeah.
And
I know that one.
It was just I couldn't read it too much without going through the absurdity. So someone can look in the Roll Call archives for this. My takedown of Amelia Bedelia for mayor.
You could do a follow-up on the books that I read, the kid who ran for president and then the kid who became president, which is about a 12-year-old who runs for president and, spoiler alert, successfully wins as an independent candidate after getting a constitutional amendment passed to allow him to run. So
I appreciate the effort. I appreciate the constitutional amendment. At least they address the elephant in the room.
Yes, they got it passed to clear the way for him. But I haven't read that book probably in 25 years, and I'm sure that it does not hold up to finer scrutiny of the electoral process as depicted. But
we're all probably like we're like the worst reviewers of political books. To this day, I lost all respect from a guy named Stephen J. Cannell. Now, when I was growing up, every cool television show on TV was somehow written by this guy. He did The Fall Guy. He did all these other TV shows where he wrote a political thriller about basically mobsters get their own president. It's the governor of Rhode Island is their sort of candidate. But he sort of makes his first, foray into elections in the Iowa primary. And I saw the words Iowa primary and I'm like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And I literally got pissed off. Like, if you Iowa does not hold a primary for president. If you don't get that right, then how do I know your entire, and here it is not meant to be, but it's funny how a fictional book will set you off, right? Yeah. When they get politics wrong, That's why I've never been a fan of The West Wing. I know some people love The West Wing. I'm like, it's not reality. I live in this reality. I give me Veep all day long. At least Veep is closer to reality.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is all the time we have.
And some, but go ahead.
And some. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us, for talking to us about all manner of topics from Miami football all the way to Meet the Press and the 2024 elections and beyond.
Did we talk about 2024?
maybe for a little bit.
I think it's going to be close. There you go.
There we go. That's our headline.
Yeah. It's going to be close.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to have you on again sometime down the line.
Well, and we'll see if we bring in some listeners.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thanks, guys.
At Inside Elections, we provide nonpartisan analysis of congressional, presidential, and gubernatorial races. With a combination of reporting and data, we break down the key races and bring valuable context to complex elections. Go to InsideElections.com to subscribe to the bi-weekly newsletter. We've got individual subscriptions and group packages that are tailored for association and corporate PACs. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and rate us on your favorite platform. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment. If you didn't like today's episode, please email DJ Uyangalale. We also wanted to thank our producers, Alan Tazinski and Melissa Lenner of Pretty Easy Podcasts, and associate producer, Conrad Tolosa. Please come back and join us again next time.